Cassian Rook, a war photographer who hasn't come home in 27 years, returns to the abandoned Coyote Moon Drive-In only to sell it and vanish again. But behind a hidden wall he finds a film reel, keys, and his dead aunt's note, "If you come back, don't leave again." Hours later, a polished billionaire shows up with an offer too big to refuse. Then the threats begin. And when a young mechanic discovers a birthmark in an old photo that matches her own, Cassian realizes this land isn't just property. It's a secret someone killed to bury. Stay until the end and tell us where you're watching from. Cassian Rook sat in the lumpy chair of another indistinguishable motel room, the kind where the bedspread smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke, scrolling through a dozen photos on his camera that didn't matter to him. Just faces in rubble, distant lands, places he'd been sent to capture the dying moments of someone else's crisis. He hadn't called home in 5 years, not that there was anyone left to answer. So when the knock came at the door and the front desk clerk held out a single envelope with a yellowed corner and his name scrawled in looping cursive, something inside Cassian stilled. The handwriting hit him like an old bruise. It was unmistakable. His Aunt Meredith's. But she'd been dead for over a decade. The envelope had no return address, just a thin red wax seal that had cracked slightly in transit. He opened it with a kind of detached caution and read the short letter once, then again. It wasn't long or emotional. It simply stated that he, Cassian Rook, had inherited the Coyote Moon Drive-In in Caro Ridge, New Mexico. No preamble, no sentiment. Just a sentence that sounded like a summons carved into stone. His name on a deed that shouldn't still exist. And suddenly, 27 years wasn't long enough to keep him from returning. The drive into New Mexico was a blur of heat mirages and dry road. The GPS gave up a mile before the town limits, as if even the satellites couldn't find Caro Ridge anymore. But Cassian remembered the way. Muscle memory, perhaps, or guilt. The last time he'd driven this route was the summer his brother Danny died. The summer everyone called an accident and no one really talked about again. Not after the funeral. Not after the cops dropped the investigation. Not after Cassian left and never looked back. When he pulled onto the gravel lot of the Coyote Moon, it felt like stepping into a ghost's footprint. The marquee still stood, though the letters had long since blown away, leaving only rusted tracks. The screen was there too, towering and cracked down one side like a lightning scar. Weeds grew in thick patches between the parking lanes, and the air felt thinner here, like time had sucked the oxygen out and kept it for itself. He stepped out of his truck and stood still. No camera, no distance. Just his own history staring back at him from a collapsed ticket booth and a projection room that used to smell like hot metal and popcorn. It looked untouched, yet somehow bruised. Inside the projection booth, Cassian expected nothing more than a decaying relic. Instead, what he found was something more deliberate. The dust was so thick it blanketed everything, but there were signs of intrusion or resistance. Old reels lay where they shouldn't. A broken stool had been set upright. On one wall, a faded bulletin board still held a pinned schedule from 1999, the summer of Danny's death. But it wasn't nostalgia that caught his eye. It was the door. Tucked into the back corner, barely noticeable, was a steel-reinforced door with an oxidized handle and an antique lock. Cassian ran his fingers over it, realizing quickly that the door had not been opened in a very long time. No scratch marks, no rust trails. The seal around the edges looked almost preserved, like someone had made sure this room stayed buried. He tried the handle, but it refused to turn. He stared at it for a long time, jaw clenched, before stepping back. The lock wasn't just physical. It held the weight of whatever had kept him from this place for nearly 3 decades. He stepped outside, needing air, needing movement, needing anything that didn't smell like memory. That's when he saw her. A girl, or woman, leaning against the shadowed edge of the abandoned concession stand. She was tall, sun-tanned, with grease on her hands, and a worn wrench tucked into the loop of her jeans. She didn't flinch when he looked at her. She didn't smile either. Her eyes traveled from his face to the drive-in behind him, like she was appraising something deeper than property. "You the guy who came back?" she asked, her voice even. He didn't answer. Not right away. "I'm here to sell it," he finally said, like an excuse. She didn't blink. "You shouldn't," she said plainly. "Some places don't let go easy." He frowned, trying to place her age. Maybe 19, 20 at most. "You live here?" he asked. "Nearby. With my gran. We keep to ourselves." Her name, she said, was Juniper Calder, but everyone called her Juno. "You want help digging it out?" she asked, nodding toward the booth. He hesitated. "I'm not staying long." "Doesn't matter," she said. "Some things need to be found before you go." Cassian wanted to say no. He wanted to remind her he wasn't here for sentiment, for nostalgia, or to play house with old ghosts. But something in the way her eyes kept flicking to the projection booth, no, to the sealed room inside it, made him stop. She wasn't just curious. She was guarding it, in her own way. And something about that, about her, really, tugged at the part of him that still carried Danny's laugh in a jar sealed tight under years of silence. "You know what's behind that door?" he asked. Juno shook her head. "Not exactly. But my gran says your aunt used to go in there and come out quieter than she went in." Cassian nodded once and let the moment pass. No agreement, no decision. Just a pause. That night, he stayed in his truck, parked under the broken marquee. He didn't light a fire. He didn't call anyone. He stared at the cracked screen like it might show him something if he looked hard enough. And as the wind rattled loose bits of tin and weeds scratched the underside of his tires, Cassian realized something cold and certain. He had come to sell a property, but the place was already selling him back his past. Cassian didn't expect her to show up again. He'd arrived early that morning with the intention of working alone, which was how he functioned best, silent, unseen, in control of his surroundings. Solitude was armor, and he wore it well. But Juno shattered that plan within minutes, walking across the lot like she'd clocked in for a shift, only she had assigned herself. She didn't knock or ask permission. She carried a dented red toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other, which she set down beside the entrance to the projection booth like they were sacred offerings. "It's not great coffee," she said, unscrewing the cap, "but it's hot, and you look like hell." Cassian didn't respond at first. He just stared at her, silently measuring whether it was worth trying to make her leave. Then she handed him a rag without looking at him, and picked up a rusted screwdriver like she knew where every screw in that booth had once belonged. He should have told her to go. Instead, he took the rag and wiped down the metal shelf by the reels, his silence becoming something not quite approval, but less than rejection. That was enough for her. Their teamwork wasn't graceful. It was a series of collisions, trial and error, brushes of hands and unspoken decisions. When the ladder wobbled, he braced it for her. When his fingers trembled over a fuse box he didn't understand, she gently pushed his hand away and fixed it herself. Neither of them explained why they were still there. They just were. As the day wore on, Juno pointed out spots in the booth that didn't match the rest. Wood panels screwed in with newer nails, a section of baseboard that was uneven. "This part doesn't belong," she muttered, pressing her palm to the wall. "It's like someone covered something up fast." Cassian narrowed his eyes and stepped closer, brushing his hand over the seam. The grain didn't line up. The paint was a shade too fresh. His instincts, honed from years of watching people lie through photographs and body language, kicked in. "Here," he said, "help me pry it." With 2 crowbars and a bit of leverage, they peeled away the panel, and what spilled out wasn't dust or mold, but secrets. Inside the narrow cavity behind the false wall was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, carefully tied like someone expected to come back for it. Juno reached in first, pulling it out with both hands, her breath catching when she realized how heavy it was. Cassian unwrapped it slowly, the fabric damp with age. Inside was a film canister, a tarnished ring of keys, and several pages folded and torn, the edges frayed from handling. The handwriting hit him immediately. It was his Aunt Meredith's, sharp and slanted, looping in places where emotion had clearly shaken her hand. One note stood out. "If you come back, don't leave again." 7 words. Cassian read them once, then again. His throat locked up so hard he had to turn away, coughing into his shoulder and pretending it was the dust. Juno read the note after him, slower, as if the words weren't instructions, but a language she'd always known. Loss, return, pleading. "She didn't want this buried," Juno said softly. "She wanted you to find it." Cassian didn't answer. Couldn't. He stared at the film canister, now cradled in Juno's arms like a newborn made of memories, and felt something break loose in him, slow and sharp. Cassian moved to open the canister right then, hands reaching with a sense of urgency, but Juno stopped him, not forcefully, but with a gentle press of her palm against his. "Wait," she said. "Not like this, not in a rush." Her voice held something he couldn't define, a kind of emotional intelligence that saw the moment more clearly than he could. "Whatever's in there, we can't undo it once we see it." He hesitated. Everything in him wanted to tear it open, to finally know. But he nodded, letting the moment breathe. Together they carried the canister and notes to the back of the booth, where the old projector stood dormant. Juno knelt beside it, her hands working with surprising delicacy as she cleaned the lens, checked the feed system, and replaced a missing bolt from her own supply. Cassian helped in silence, his movements slow, deliberate. Every part of the machine felt familiar and foreign all at once. "Haven't tested it in years," Juno said, flicking on a backup generator she'd wired earlier. "Might explode, might purr." Cassian let out a half laugh, mostly nerves. "That's the story of my whole life." The projector groaned and sputtered, struggling at first like a body trying to breathe again after a coma. Then, with a mechanical shiver, it came to life. The bulb flickered, then steadied. Juno fed the first few inches of film into the reel, letting it wind through the machine. Cassian's fingers hovered just above the strip, watching it flutter like a fragile wing. It was real, tangible. Not a ghost or rumor or story, but something that could be played, paused, examined. The moment turned reverent. Neither spoke. For Cassian, it wasn't just about the contents of the reel, it was what it meant to have found it. A voice long gone, an intention never forgotten. He saw Danny then, not as a memory locked in trauma, but as a real boy, laughing on the hood of a car under this very screen. It hit like a gut punch, how easily he could recall the sound of that laughter, and how long he had buried it. Juno placed her hand lightly on his arm, anchoring him to the now. "You okay?" she asked. Cassian nodded, lying. "Let's see what they left behind," he said, his voice almost steady. As the reel began to turn, the film slipping into motion, Cassian didn't blink. He couldn't. Not yet. His past was no longer something held only in memory or guilt. It was here, in celluloid and ink, in a sealed wall and a girl who refused to let him face it alone. Whatever played on that screen would matter. It would change things. Maybe not for the world, but for him. And as the image blinked to life, raw and unsteady, Cassian realized the difference between remembering and proving. One protects you, the other sets you free. The machine sputtered again, like it was catching its breath. Juno leaned forward, adjusting the reel. Cassian's hands shook, not from age, but from what he was about to see. His brother's ghost, his aunt's voice, a truth wrapped in oilcloth that refused to die quietly. And just as the film stuttered through the gate and light flooded the booth, Cassian felt the line blur between what was and what still demanded to be known. The past had stopped being a story he told himself, and had become a thing that could be proven. Cassian returned from a supply run with a box of electrical parts and 2 burritos that were already cooling in the passenger seat. The air outside had begun to thicken with that dry, pre-storm wait, though he barely registered it. He was too focused on what he and Juno had uncovered behind the false wall and the plans they'd made to restore the projector fully before daring to thread the film. But when he pulled back into the gravel lot of the Coyote Moon, he spotted it instantly. A black SUV idling near the faded marquee, its glossy surface entirely out of place against the dull grit of the town. A man stood beside it, posture relaxed but too perfectly curated, like he'd practiced looking approachable. Tailored suit, no dust, no creases. Even the sun seemed to avoid touching him. Cassian parked and stepped out slowly, setting the box on the hood. The man extended a hand as if they were old friends reuniting. "Bramwell Klein," he said. "Cassian Rook, right? Been meaning to talk with you." Cassian didn't take the hand. He just nodded once. "You found me." Bramwell laughed, easy and rehearsed. "Well, small town. News travels fast, and so do opportunities." Bramwell launched into his pitch like someone selling a timeshare in paradise. He spoke of progress, economic development, a new highway, an open-air shopping center designed to honor the natural charm of Caro Ridge. The drive-in, he said, sat on a vital parcel of land that would serve as the main artery for this expansion. "You'd be doing the town a favor," he added, handing over a folded offer sheet. Cassian unfolded it slowly, eyeing the number. High enough to be obscene, enough to tempt anyone who still saw the drive-in as a rotting relic. "It's generous," Cassian admitted, folding it again. "But I'm not interested." Bramwell's smile didn't slip. It simply changed temperature, cooling by degrees. "Everyone has a price," he said. "Maybe you just haven't named yours yet." Cassian stepped closer, his voice low. "This place isn't for sale." The answer wasn't just about loyalty. It was about evidence, buried truths, and the nagging certainty that what lay inside that film reel could gut the very empire Bramwell was trying to build. Bramwell tilted his head, still wearing that polished smirk. "Be careful, Mr. Rook. Nostalgia can be expensive." The consequences began quietly. The next morning, Cassian found a violation notice taped to the booth door. Something about overdue property taxes from 2006. By that evening, the water to the drive-in had been mysteriously shut off. 2 days later, the power flickered and died, and the electric company claimed no record of recent payment, despite Cassian showing them a receipt. Patrol cars began circling the lot at night, slow and silent, their headlights sweeping over his truck like searchlights. One even stopped to ask about expired registration. His plates were fine. Cassian kept his calm, but tension began pressing against his ribs like a vice. And when Juno's grandmother found a code violation pinned to the trailer behind the gas station, "Hazardous structural wear," it read, Cassian saw the pressure was no longer subtle. It was deliberate, coordinated, personal. That night, he tried to convince Juno to stay away. "You don't owe me anything," he said, standing near the half-lit marquee. "If they start pushing harder—" She cut him off. "You think I've never been pushed before?" she snapped. "This place means something to me, too." Her eyes burned, not with fear, but with fury. "I'm not going anywhere." Cassian didn't argue again. Not after that. Instead, he started locking up the booth each night and double-checking the reel's hiding spot, always glancing over his shoulder. What had begun as a reluctant return now felt like standing inside a minefield. That's when Yara Batista appeared. She came in quietly without fanfare, late one evening as the sun dipped low. Cassian was tightening a loose wire in the projection booth when he heard footsteps on gravel and turned to see her. Thin, dark-haired, wearing worn scrubs and carrying a small tote. She looked around before speaking. "I'm not here for trouble," she said. "I heard you found something. Some notes. They have her handwriting." Cassian didn't ask how she knew. Instead, he handed her one of the torn slips from the stash behind the wall. Yara took it in both hands, her fingers trembling. She ran her thumb over the letters like she was touching someone's face. "This is Meredith," she whispered. "Your aunt. She used to help people like me. People with no safe place to go." Her voice cracked. She kept secrets because the town didn't want them seen. As the night deepened, Yara sat on a stool near the projector and told them everything she knew. Meredith Rook hadn't just been a quirky woman who lived alone and owned a dying drive-in. She had been a lifeline, quietly documenting abuse cases, giving temporary shelter to undocumented workers, helping women escape violent husbands. And according to Yara, she had spent the final years of her life collecting information on the Klein family, paper trails, recorded conversations, photographs. She was scared, Yara admitted, eyes flicking toward the SUV's memory still lingering outside. She knew if anything happened, no one would believe her, except maybe a nephew who used to believe in stories. Juno looked at Cassian then, like a question was being asked of him without words. And he knew. Selling the property wasn't just surrender, it was complicity. If he walked away, the truth went with him, locked behind that projection screen, buried in a reel no one else would ever see. He exhaled slowly, chest tight. She trusted I'd come back, he murmured, and she made sure I couldn't leave clean. That wasn't regret in his voice. It was acceptance. Maybe for the first time in decades. So when Bramwell returned 2 days later, no SUV this time, just a courier delivering a second offer with a slightly higher number, Cassian didn't even open the envelope. He handed it back unopened, locking eyes with the young man in the pressed polo shirt. "Tell your boss the answer's still no," he said. "And next time, don't bother with the sugarcoating." That night, as he sat inside the projection booth with Juno and Yara nearby, Cassian felt the weight of choice settle firmly on his shoulders. Not the kind of choice you make and forget. The kind that lives in your spine. For the first time, staying wasn't about memory or guilt or even grief. It was about standing between something sacred and someone determined to destroy it. The Coyote Moon wasn't real estate anymore. It was a barricade, a last stand. A lighthouse someone once built in the middle of nowhere and left burning just in case he ever returned. Cassian no longer questioned why. The shape of the choice had closed around him, and for once in his life he didn't flinch. They moved like ghosts, careful and intentional, as if every step they took might trigger something hidden. The drive-in had become more than a property. It was now their safe house, their war room, their living, breathing archive of secrets. Cassian brought his camera out for the first time in weeks, not to take photos for sale or publication, but to document the details they were uncovering, scraps of old receipts, annotations in the margins of ledgers, names half erased by time. Juno became the muscle and mind of the operation, rerouting power from the trailer park's neglected generator to keep the projector alive, welding broken hinges, patching things that were never meant to be seen again. And Yara, quiet and razor-focused, activated her own network. Housekeepers, groundskeepers, night shift workers, all the invisible people who'd learned to survive by staying quiet and paying attention. They stored the film and notes in rotating places, under the cracked floorboards of the concession stand, inside a hollowed popcorn machine, taped beneath a row of seats, where once teenagers had carved out hearts and initials now faded. They didn't speak much during these handoffs. It was safer that way. Eyes were everywhere now, and the town had grown colder in subtle, suffocating ways. Cassian found himself remembering his brother more and more, not as a symbol, not as a scar, but as a kid who once snuck gummy bears into movies and sang terribly during the credits. That night had once been a wall in his mind, a place he didn't go. But lately, fragments had returned. Danny skipping rocks in the back lot, asking questions about how projectors worked, arguing about the best movie endings. The idea that it had all ended in an accident now felt like a mockery. People don't erase accidents, Juno had muttered once. They erase choices. It echoed louder each time Cassian stared at the film reel they hadn't dared to play yet. It was during one of those late nights when silence seemed heavier than conversation that Juno began sorting through the clippings behind the old concession counter. Most were brittle and sun-bleached, clippings of charity events, school fundraisers, and vaguely written obituaries. She worked fast, mechanically, until her fingers stopped on a photograph tucked behind a poster for a 1995 horror double feature. She didn't move for nearly a full minute. Cassian noticed first that her hands were still, then that her breathing had changed. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just held out the photograph, her arm rigid. It was black and white, a press photo of a fundraising gala dated 1990. In the center were two familiar figures: Bramwell Klein's father, Everett, in a sharp suit and too wide grin, and Cassian's Aunt Meredith, standing beside him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They were shaking hands, framed by a backdrop of banners and balloons. But it wasn't them that mattered. In the lower right corner, barely in frame, was a woman holding a baby wrapped in a patterned blanket. The mother's face was turned away. The baby's was mostly obscured. Except for one detail, just visible above the edge of the blanket was a bare ankle, and on it, a mark. Juno stared at it like it had just named her. A crescent-shaped birthmark, curved and imperfect, like a moon smudged by time. Her hand, almost reflexively, reached down and pulled up her pant leg. There, above the bone, was the exact same shape, same spot, same asymmetry. She didn't speak. Her expression didn't crumble. It emptied. Like someone had unlocked a vault inside her and left the door swinging wide open with no answers inside. Cassian understood before she could say it. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a look-alike. It was a match too precise to be ignored. Juno folded the photograph once, then again, hands trembling so hard the paper crinkled unevenly. "I've had it forever," she said finally, voice small. "I used to ask Gran about it when I was a kid. She always said I was born with it, but never talked about where or who." Her eyes met his, wide and hollow. "I thought I was just some kid left behind." Cassian didn't try to speak. He had nothing to offer that wouldn't sound hollow. In all his years of documenting pain, refugees, war zones, bombings, he'd never seen someone fall apart so quietly. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just unraveled in front of him, every muscle in her face, learning how to grieve something she'd never even known she'd lost. It wasn't just the discovery that shook her. It was what it implied. The drive-in hadn't just been a place of hiding. It had been a place of preservation, a fortress built not for nostalgia but for protection. Juno had never just found refuge there. She had been kept there, hidden, guarded. "They didn't want anyone to know," she said, more to herself than to him. "If that's me, if that baby is me, then this isn't just about money or land or silence." Her words came slowly, like she had to convince herself they were real. "This is about bloodlines, inheritance, reputation." She stood then, pacing in a small circle, her energy raw and frayed. "Why would your aunt have this? Why keep it all this time?" Cassian swallowed hard. "Because she knew, or she found out, and she knew they'd come for it eventually." He watched her come undone, and something inside him cracked, not sympathy, not pity, but a deep paternal ache he hadn't felt in years. He had photographed children running from fire, but this girl, this woman, was running from a truth that had chased her whole life in silence. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that she was safe now. But he couldn't lie, not with squad cars circling every few nights and the air feeling more like a warning with every passing hour. Instead, he did the only thing that mattered. He stayed. He didn't pick up his camera. He didn't take a single picture. He just stayed. Outside, the patrols had returned, slow and deliberate. One car, then another, headlights off, tires crunching gravel just loud enough to be heard. Juno stood near the projection booth door, photograph still clutched in her hand, staring toward the faint red and blue flashes in the far-off distance. The desert sky stretched wide and unforgiving above them, too vast to hold the storm that was coming. She wasn't shaking anymore. Something had hardened in her posture, a resolve or maybe just a surrender to what could no longer be denied. Cassian stood beside her, watching the darkness gather and settle like dust that wouldn't be swept away. The revelation hadn't come in fireworks or screams. It had arrived in a grainy corner of a forgotten photo, but its weight was impossible to ignore. Juno wasn't just part of this story. She might be the reason it existed at all. And as they stood in silence, watching the town inch toward them one uniform at a time, Cassian knew the next decision wouldn't be about the past anymore. It would be about who they were willing to become in order to protect the truth. And neither of them flinched. It started before dawn, before the sun had fully dragged itself over the ridge. The first sign wasn't the police cruisers or the black vans that parked along the edge of the lot. It was the silence, thick, anticipatory, the kind that signaled a town holding its breath. Cassian stood in front of the concession stand, his boots rooted to the gravel even as his gut screamed for him to disappear. He'd survived war zones with less tension. Juno was beside him, steady despite the fear she tried hard to swallow. She hadn't said a word since sunrise, only checked the projector 3 times and touched the film reel like it was holy. Yara stood back, half-shadowed, eyes darting between the lawmen and the lines they hadn't yet dared to cross. Bramwell arrived late, in tailored slacks and sunglasses, hands in his pockets like this was a brunch meeting and not a siege. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone radiated the confidence of someone who believed time and pressure always broke people eventually. Cassian scanned the perimeter and realized he was waiting for backup that wouldn't come. Until it did. First, Juno's grandmother, then a man from the gas station, then a neighbor. One by one they appeared, not loud, not armed, just present. It didn't take long before there were dozens. Some brought lawn chairs, some carried flashlights or held their kids' hands. Someone passed out bottles of water like this was a community gathering. They didn't yell, they didn't confront the police. They simply stood, forming a line between authority and the drive-in, between threat and memory. Cassian watched, heart thudding, as the lawmen grew visibly uncomfortable. Power liked silence. Power thrived in shadows. But here, under the soft murmurs and smartphone cameras, power had nowhere to hide. Cassian whispered to Juno, "It's time." She nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the projection booth, her hands only trembling once before she touched the film. Inside, she moved with method and care, threading the reel with the same intensity she once gave to machines and broken fuses. The projector hesitated, coughed, shuddered, but didn't fail. It came alive with a quiet hum, like it knew this was its moment. Cassian stood outside, watching the screen flicker, then blaze to life. No movie title, no trailers, just footage. Raw, grainy, real. And then, the voices. Male, sharp, familiar. The words weren't coded or subtle. They were matter-of-fact, like men discussing maintenance schedules or dinner plans. "The kid won't say anything," one voice muttered. "He was already weak." Another. "The fire covered most of it. As long as the woman keeps quiet, it won't trace back." And then the gut punch, Danny's name. Not as a brother, not as a boy, but as a problem, an obstacle, a cleanup. Cassian staggered back a half-step, breath gone. The pain wasn't loud. It was surgical, clean, like hearing the final nail in a coffin you hadn't realized was still open. Somewhere behind him, someone sobbed. Not polite, not restrained. It was the kind of sound that cracked glass. A woman collapsed to her knees, face in her hands. Someone else whispered, "Dear God." Cassian turned just enough to see Bramwell's expression flicker, his perfect smile folding at the edges like a paper mask wilting in heat. The officers began to shift. They weren't backing down yet, but they weren't advancing either. Not with cameras on, not with eyes on every move. For the first time, Cassian saw it clearly. Fear doesn't break when confronted. It breaks when it's witnessed. No one cheered. This wasn't a victory. It was exposure. The light didn't bring justice. It brought truth, and truth carried its own weight. After the footage ended, no one moved right away. It was as if the desert had swallowed the noise, leaving only consequence behind. The officers regrouped, speaking into radios, unsure whether to retreat or escalate. Bramwell was already gone. No dramatic exit. He simply turned and walked toward a waiting car. His departure wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Cassian knew this wasn't over. The aftermath would be paperwork, investigations, retaliations. But the narrative had changed. The drive-in wasn't a forgotten property anymore. It was evidence. It was a wound reopened, one the town could no longer pretend didn't exist. In the days that followed, reporters showed up. So did attorneys. So did people who had never spoken aloud about what they'd seen or endured. Yara offered statements in private, her voice shaky but firm. Cassian spoke at one town hall, then refused interviews. Juno said nothing to the media. Her truth had already been projected, permanently. Some threats came, mostly anonymous. Some doors slammed. But the silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like cowardice. And cowardice no longer ruled. Weeks passed before Cassian went to the county office, not to sell the property, not to file a complaint, but to file paperwork that left his hands trembling even as he signed it. Legal guardianship, something he never thought he'd ask for, much less receive. The clerk, an older woman with no interest in gossip, only gave a small nod when she saw the name. "She'll be safer with you," she said quietly. Cassian didn't know if that was true, but he was willing to try. Back at the Coyote Moon, the lot was quiet again. Juno sat at the edge of the screen with her ankle bare for the first time. The birthmark, that moon slice of truth, caught the glow of the test projector like a badge. She didn't cover it anymore. Yara, who had once only stepped in shadows, now stood openly by the concession stand, holding a ring of keys with her name engraved in steel. They'd made her official, hired, titled, seen. Cassian climbed into the booth, hung the torn note above the projector. "If you come back, don't leave again." It didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a promise kept. The first movie night wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. People came anyway, drawn by something older than nostalgia. They brought folding chairs, radios, picnic baskets. No one mentioned Bramwell. No one talked about the investigation. But when the projector flickered on and the film began to roll, not evidence this time, but a classic comedy from 1986, people laughed. They leaned against one another. They let the night carry them. Cassian didn't sit alone. He sat between Juno and Yara, shoulders touching, not speaking. He didn't need to. The desert didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt held. He watched as the screen lit up once more, not as a weapon, but as a welcome, a signal to anyone watching. We're still here. We are still standing. And maybe, just maybe, we're home.